Leandro, you're in La Jolla conference.
Thank you.
We appreciate the participation of the IDB, and it's great to have the Energy Division Chief here this year. And I want to talk a little bit about, and you spoke as part of our Renewable Energy Plenary, and I want to talk a little bit about, you had your annual meeting in Cancun, I think it was in March, and there was a doubling, I believe, in terms of the IDB's commitment to sustainable energy across the hemisphere, across Latin America. Tell me a little bit about how that's going to be implemented, what that means.
Sure. In the Cancun meeting at the annual meeting at the IDB, basically at that meeting there was a couple things happened. One is that member countries decided to increase IDB's paid-in capital by $70 billion. Currently we have $100 billion of paid-in capital, so we're almost going to be doubling our portfolio. And second is, based on the request by our member countries, we will be doubling our sustainable energy sector, which includes energy, transport, oil and gas, and so forth, for sustainable energy, and particularly to mitigate climate change issues.
So talk sustainable energy. Help us with the definition of that, because I don't know if I really understand. Well,
sustainable energy, on the electricity sector, for instance, we have agreed on thresholds of coal-fired plants. We're the only multilateral that has agreed on thresholds. We will not finance subcritical plants. Supercritical and super ultra-critical will have efficiency targets. So you're producing more energy with less CO2 emissions. Although that's still fossil fuel, it's more sustainable than the current production. Second is renewable energy per se. Renewable energy, things that you have either energy neutral or CO2 neutral emissions, and also CO2 negative, where you're actually displacing existing facilities that are producing CO2. So it has a combination, and this is on the electricity side. On other sectors, for instance, sustainable forestry, the 40% of the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is based on land use changes. So one of the things that the IDB is focusing is how to make those land use changes less significant in terms of CO2 emissions and mitigate some of those. And on the sustainable energy side, on the sustainable transport side, we also have, for instance, the high-speed rail trains that we're doing between Sao Paulo and Rio. We're financing that particular project, which then will eliminate cars on the road that actually are competing infrastructure. So that's the kind of things that we're doing at IDB.
So let's talk a little bit about, I think we both have been to many events, and we've talked a lot. Everyone knows sort of the huge potential of renewable resources in Latin America. I mean, one could say the unrealized, if you sort of put hydro aside, the unrealized natural resource potential for renewables. What are some of the regulatory issues? I know the IDB's looked at some of these, whether it be the cost structure, the feed-in tariff issues, subsidy issues. Talk a little bit about how we can begin to realize some of the region's potential in renewables, what some of the regulatory sort of issues that you guys are looking at and trying to work on as a multilateral bank.
Well, I think one of the problems that we see is most countries, with the exception of very few, are very incipient on the regulatory structure. I mean, it's always based on the traditional energy. When you introduce renewable energy, particularly when you have oscillation volatility of the input, which is the wind or the solar or the hydro, it doesn't fit well with the traditional regulatory structure. What we're thinking of doing is how to overcome those barriers. And one of the ways we're looking to overcome those barriers is by being very aggressive and having the government assume a lot of responsibility. Typically, higher risk early on that they would otherwise want to assume on traditional fossil fuel plants or traditional energy plants. One would be a take or pay on the wind side, and that means that they take the wind risk. Another would be mitigating some of the costs up front, because the big cost for renewables is actually the capital costs. It's different than traditional energy projects where there's a lot of civil works. Renewables on the wind side or on the solar side, you manufacture typically outside the region, and the cost is 90% the cost of manufacturing and 10% is the cost of logistics, transporting it and installing it. And then you have a substation or a transmission line that hooks up to it. By that system, it's really indifferent if you have a public sector project or a private sector project. The main difference is a lot on the funding side, where a private sector project is going to have significant returns on your investment, and also you're going to have less favorable terms and conditions of financing because you're a private sector company. And the most typical lowest cost solution is always the cheapest pricing of the cheapest debt. And that always seems to be the sovereign lending, because that's where the countries are able to borrow at the cheapest rate. So what we're looking is ways for the countries to utilize cheap financing, and they can on-lend this financing to the private companies, or they can actually build it on a public sector projects. Brazil with Proinfa was the very first, which was done 3 years ago, which was very, very good example of how government can change policies and give the right incentives to the private sector in order for them to come in within budget and within tariff structures. We are, I guess, in a certain sense, we're less fortunate because some of the countries in Central America and the Caribbean, the tariffs are so high to begin with because they're based on fossil fuels. So a lot of these renewable energy projects can already come in with the existing tariff structure if adequate financing is available. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do.
So let's just wrap here. And it sounds like you're extremely optimistic that the region is moving towards being able to realize some of this potential, and I guess diversify, especially when you talk about Central America and the Caribbean, diversify their energy sources.
What we want is indigenous sources of energy. If you're a region or country that produces gas, then you should have gas as one of your fuel sources. We don't think that all your neighbors should have gas as their fuel source, because then they start having balance of payments issues, because you're going to be importing that fossil fuel in order to produce electricity. There needs to be a significant change in price differential between the imported cost of whatever outside fuel it is to your indigenous source. And if there isn't, then you shouldn't be importing, because it changes your balance of payments. The second important factor is that the countries should diversify their energy matrix. We've seen it currently in Venezuela with the hydrology issue, where there's a lot of hydrology. We've seen it in Colombia, also with hydrology issues. We've seen issues where Chile 2 years ago was predominant gas because of the reduction in exports from Argentina to Chile. Chile had to convert a lot of their gas plants to diesel plants. Now they're putting LNG terminals. So I think there needs to be a diversified matrix throughout, either on a country basis and on a regional basis. And that obviously includes renewables. And the renewable side, although small now, the future is renewables. I mean, you see the writing on the wall, and you see that the countries will engage in and embrace renewables. Why? Because operation maintenance cost is less expensive for renewables than traditional energy. There is no input fuel.
So one final question. You're from Brazil, I believe, right? Do you think Brazil is going to win the World Cup this year?
I think so.
All right. Leandro Alves, thank you.